Welcome to Community Capital, a podcast about visionary founders and dedicated community builders who are shaping the future one connection at a time. I'm your host, Zara Nukvi, head of founder community at Republic. Today I'm speaking with Miri Buckland, co-founder of Landing. Miri has an incredible background. She's worked in venture, she's worked in media, she is a Forbes 30 Under 30 recipient, and she's also a Stanford MBA grad. Landing is a platform that allows you to create vision boards digitally. It really marries creativity and community because you're also able to share your vision boards with other people, especially if you're creating stuff that other people are excited about as well. Today we're going to be speaking a little bit more about fundraising tips that Miri has, how her previous experience kind of informed her leadership and founder style at Landing, and how they navigated pivoting from a completely different industry. Landing was initially like an aesthetics and renovation furniture platform to the incredible vision boarding, creative community that it is now. Thank you so much for being here, Miri. You're so accomplished. Admire everything you've done. You've done venture, you've worked at a huge media company, and then now you're the co-founder of Landing, an incredible platform that I use literally all the time whenever I have an idea. And so I would love to kind of understand, like, early on in your career, did you know you wanted to be a founder? What was that like early on in your career?
I really didn't, and I feel like that's sometimes a bit controversial to say because a lot of people expect you to have wanted to be a founder since you were born and like have done all these entrepreneurial things growing up, and I honestly didn't really know what I wanted to be when I was growing up, and I felt a lot of pressure to figure that out. And I'm kind of glad that I waited a little bit to try different things, discover different things, and kind of see where life took me. I think I always knew that I wanted to be in business, but I didn't really know what that meant. Like, I didn't really know how businesses worked or what kind of roles you could do in them, and like who were the type of people who even started businesses. And so growing up, I think it was like this very loose idea that I wanted to work in a great team. I wanted to build something. I wanted to have an impact, but I didn't know that that would lead me to entrepreneurship. And I think what I was trying to do early on in my career was give myself options and learn as much as I could and work for people that I really admired. And kind of over time, that led me from studying economics and management at undergrad to working at Sky TV, the media company, to then business school and then starting Landing. So it definitely wasn't something that I was set on from a very young age. It's more something that I kind of evolved into. And I think that's okay.
Yeah. And I think, like, speaking to that evolution of the experiences you had and then founding Landing, what I find really fascinating is talking to founders who then kind of have, like, I don't want to say like a moment or maybe like a gradual build of feelings when it comes to founding that company. What was that like for you? Was this something in the back of your head that you just constantly thought about and then decided to take action? Like, what was the moment or the moments, I guess, that led to the founding of Landing?
Yeah, there wasn't like one specific moment. I would say, again, it was a bit more of an evolution and a lot of like smaller moments that led up to it. So at business school, I met Ellie, my co-founder. So that was obviously one of the big moments. And we were kind of talking about and coming at this idea of like, what is creativity and why do some people feel like they are creative and some people don't? And we were kind of coming at that question and that problem from two very different angles. Like, Ellie is the traditionally creative person. She's super artistic. She did studio art undergrad. She's the friend that everyone goes to for interior design help. And I was the person who was like not creative or told I wasn't creative. I was the one who was really interested in maths and science growing up. I was like, women in STEM. But I had this belief in this label that I like was not a creative person. And we started talking about that as the issue. And it took me a long time to kind of like unlearn that belief that I wasn't creative. And we together started talking about how can we help more people embrace their creativity, empower their creativity. And originally we were talking about that in the context of furnishing physical spaces. So how can you design a space that feels like yours and you feel really empowered in the process? And when we started exploring that problem at school, we just kept getting like pulled in the direction that it was a good idea and something we should keep testing. And we kept uncovering different like learnings through all the different experiments we were doing. And so from the original kind of discussion about creativity, we just kept kind of pulling the thread. And we took a number of classes around starting a business, and so that helped us kind of like formalize it a little bit more. But there was also definitely a moment in our second year of business school where we looked at each other and kind of said, like, you're not applying for real jobs, are you? And neither of us were. And so that, I guess, was another moment where we decided to kind of like take the leap of faith.
When you made the decision to found the company and go forward with everything, what were like some of the first few things you did? And I know that sounds like such a simple question, but I'm always fascinated to think about whether people approach like the legal formation or if it's like the name of the company and like what those initial like conversations were like.
Yeah, we really started with the user. So before founding the company, naming the company, anything like that, we really started with like trying to understand the problem. Like that was the very first thing, like what are users doing? And when we, or what are they challenged with? And when we were thinking about creativity in terms of interior design, we were actually like going to IKEA, talking to people in the store. We were like helping our friends furnish their apartments for free. We were like literally building furniture. We built 200 pieces of furniture ourselves in one summer to like really go through the process with people and be in their shoes and understand it and uncover like the nuances of the problem. So that was where we really started. And a lot of that was thanks to the design school at Stanford, where they teach you this kind of way of learning and experimenting and design thinking. So we really started with like, before you try and create any solution, like get really deeply into the problem and understanding who your users are. And that's something I think that's like served us throughout Landing, because we are now a very different company to where we started, but that's all been through very user-centric testing, learning, and pivoting along the way.
I mean, I think like Landing now and Landing before, when it was different, two equally incredible ideas, but how did you navigate the process of recognizing you needed to pivot, and how did it look in terms of like rebranding and relaunching and kind of going in another direction?
I mean, I think the beauty of pivots is that you can have relaunches and redirection. Like you can have as many as you want if you're like launching a new thing. And I think sometimes people think of like launch as this like finite moment and like you only get one shot at it. That might be true if you're like not going to iterate a ton on your product. But for us at least, we've had many different versions of Landing and many different launch moments. And so I think there is really a skill or trait that is like being unafraid of change. And I think that's really, really important in a founder, because you have to not preempt it, but like be very quick to respond. And that doesn't mean like over responding or like erratic responses. I think it means validating and being okay with like moving along with your users in search of the real kind of like product market fit. And so the way you do that is you get as much information as you can. So from the very beginning, I think we've been very focused on trying to get volume of really strong user feedback, user research, quantitative, qualitative, to be able to validate these changes as we go and not just make them on gut instinct.
When it came to like the fundraising process for what Landing is now, you had an incredible fundraising process. Cowboy, also a VC fund that I love. How was that fundraising process for you in terms of just like maybe top 3 tips you'd give to other founders when they're approaching their seed round?
So I think for seed round, it's really interesting because at that point you basically have an idea. You might have some early traction, but you're really talking about like the big vision and the team. And how you're going to solve it is probably going to change. And so I think one of my biggest tips is like get that story really right, and then find people who believe in you and they believe in the vision, and be flexible in what the solution is, and make sure those investors are also flexible in what the solution is, because anyone at a seed stage is probably going to change their solution. And so I think that served us really well, because we were telling that story about like why this needs to exist and who we are and why we're the right people to do it and why we're the right people to do it now. We weren't saying, okay, this version of the interior design product or this version of Landing as a social app is exactly what it's going to be in the future. And then I think like the other thing is to really get to know the investors that you're talking to and working with. And I know that the tendency is want to just like get the round done, but like they want to take their time getting to know you, and you kind of need to do the same thing, because you are with them for a really long time and you're going to be working together very intensely. So I think actually like giving yourself the space and the time, if you can, to have those relationships over a number of months rather than just like going straight into a raise and shooting just for the outcome of cash, you know. And then the last thing I would say that served us really well was we often did like our own references on investors too. So like how they do references on you, we spoke to tons of people who were founders in their portfolios, who had been super successful, who had shut down their businesses, like all different people. And that gave us a lot of faith in like choosing the right people too.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's such a great piece of advice, because I feel like founders wouldn't think that they can do the same things that investors are doing to them, and kind of vice versa. And so having covered, I guess, the capital part of the Community Capital podcast, I think a huge reason of why I admire and love what you've built with Landing is the community. When I think of anytime anyone says like community-driven companies or the companies of the future that are going to be driven by community, I immediately think of Landing because of what you've built. I think community is a word that really confuses people, because sometimes they think, okay, I need to find someone with a community already and maybe tap into them, or I don't even know where to begin with community, like what does it mean? And so for you, how did you approach like even just the thought of community? Because I know you're very user driven and it must have like kind of come from that, but I'd be really curious to understand really early on in the process of founding the company and creating Landing as it is today, how did you define community? Were you thinking of it? Like when did that become part of the Landing journey?
Yeah, so it definitely changed over time. I would say, like, as I was saying earlier, I think we were very user-centric from the beginning, but I think that's different to being community-centric. So we were doing a lot of one-on-one interviews. We were doing a lot of like going through the like creation and mood boarding process with like individual people. But the transition from like Landing users to Landing community really happened because our users asked us for it. So they started saying, I don't want this solo experience of mood boarding. I want to see what other people are making. And once we kind of let them see what everybody else was making, and the feed, literally building a feed, we didn't even have one to start with. They started saying like, oh, I'm really like inspired by other people. And I like started making friends. And so you start building this kind of like digital network of connections. And I think that's what makes a community, is the like multiple ties and the strength of ties versus just the like bilateral, I guess, like one user to one user or Landing to one user relationships. But I have to credit Liz, our head of community, who has really led the charge on cultivating and strengthening that community. And it takes a lot of like really manual actions where you might think that it won't make much difference, or it might feel really small scale. But when you do that enough, and it's simple things like commenting on people's boards in the feed, or shouting them out on socials, or saying like, hey, how are you doing? Like, where are you from? Tell us about yourself. You do this really well with your community too. Like, you reach out to individual users, and then you start to see them reach out to other people in the community, and you kind of like teach them the norms and the cultures and the practices of your community and how you want it to feel, and that spreads. And so it started extremely small scale, like in a Slack with like 10 people in there who loved the very first version of Landing. Then it grew a little bit in Slack, then it grew in Discord, and now it's like growing in Landing, the product. But it's been very, very intentional, and yeah, I have to credit Liz with a lot of the thought and strategy and like community love that she's like really poured in, that we then see our ambassadors and other people replicating too.
Yeah, and then I guess kind of also referencing everything you said about like community and users, I also have loved how you're redefining the like consumer social industry that VCs have kind of created with the collective media. So I would also love to understand, like, when you first started the Landing, just like Landing in general, and then we're finding and meeting these other founders who had a similar idea of community, let's say like before it started to get really popular on Twitter. Like, what was that like, finding other founders to lean on who were also building community-driven products, or just, I'd say, the future of consumer social, which is collective media?
Totally. It was like a breath of fresh air. Honestly, I was like, oh my God, thank God we're not alone, you know? And I think like this community-driven approach has come very naturally to our team. And I found it so validating to discover these other people who were also building a similar way and had similar values of like caring deeply about people's experiences online and their connection online, and creating experiences that make us feel good and give us deeper utility and freer play than existing socials. And I think building a startup can be very lonely, even when you're in a team. And so when I started connecting with other founders through investors or through mutual friends or contacts, especially in New York, it was just amazing to have these people who could really relate to what we're doing and the mission of what we're doing, even if they were building different solutions to the problem. And so, yeah, we pulled together this group, the Collective Media Group, which is a cohort of founders. There's about 60 people in it now who,
oh, wow.
I know.
That's amazing.
Yeah, of like builders and founders and supporters of the movement, of people who just like are building with the same values in mind and want to help each other.
Yeah.
And when I think about like how you create lasting and enduring change in an industry as big as consumer social, I think you need numbers to be able to do it.
Yeah.
And so I've really enjoyed meeting these people and meeting people who have that same feeling of like we can help each other, like get a leg up here and support each other with the most challenging things, rather than it just being a kind of like competitive, everybody, you know, hold their secrets close to their chest. I don't think that really actually serves any of us.
Yeah. But I am just curious to hear your thoughts on how you think community and I guess like Gen Z on the internet and just like online communities are going to be evolving as like the ecosystem and VC and more companies get funded.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think communities have kind of always fueled the internet and built the internet, especially fandoms. And that is really fascinating to me. And I think we have for a long time underestimated the power of fandoms and particularly women on the internet. And I think that there's a bit of a recognition of the power of it and influence that those groups of people have. And also a bit more of a acknowledgement and respect that people don't just want to be treated as an audience, they want to be treated as real humans. And I think a lot of community-driven initiatives recognize that a bit more. And so when I think about especially building for a new generation, for Gen Z, I believe, and I've seen that they are like very turned off by the extreme kind of like salesy or commercialization of existing socials, and they want to be treated like real people who want genuine recommendations, genuine experiences, places that make them feel good. And I think you can only really do that by treating people as humans, as a community, and not just as an audience. And so I think that's like a really powerful thing to tap into, both for brands trying to sell to and connect with that generation, but also for the platforms that are trying to replace or exist alongside, I will say, existing socials.
And I think I like to say that every year the VC ecosystem has like a new word or like industry that they latch onto. If it was like the creator economy in 2021, then it was like Web3, and now it's AI. And I know that you have Glitterbot and that you have kind of talked about like the future of AI and what that might look like. I feel like I just have to ask in terms of the way you kind of see, I guess, like AI and creativity combining, because I know you spoke to the fact that the Glitterbot like helps you with being like creative and prompts you and kind of gives you an outlet. And I think sometimes people feel overwhelmed and it's hard to like actually create. It is like such a like consuming task. So whenever I create something on Landing, I always am like sitting there, I'll have music, and I am really focused, which is like a huge benefit to being able to sit there and create what you want to, but it does also like take a lot of focus. And so I wonder like, what do you think in terms of the way that AI may be helpful with creativity, and like how has Landing thought about it so far?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think it really depends on the type of user, right? So for our hardcore creators, they do not want AI to replace the act of creating, right? Like they are there for the practice of creating, not just for the final output. So for those people, it's really important that any AI functionality or like features are there as a like creative sidekick or like something that makes creation more fun, not necessarily just easier. And so we're thinking about Glitterbot much more as a kind of Clippy of PowerPoint, if you remember Clippy, rather than like one-click creation. And I think that might look quite different for the more casual creator or the person who's coming into Landing to consume. There we might be able to leverage AI better for surfacing recommendations or better tagging or surfacing images in the library that you might like. And so I think that there's going to be a spectrum for like where or how assistive AI is to you, depending on like what kind of creative experience you want. But for us, it's not that we want to use AI to replace creativity and just have like, you know, turn text into your mood board, right? For us, Landing is as much a place about the process of creation and curation as it is about like getting to that final output of boards.
I mean, I loved Clippy. I was very sad when that type of like product went away. So I'm glad to hear that maybe you're thinking about bringing it back. But then my last question for you, and feel free to take a pause to think about it because it's a one-word answer. What is the one word that you would use to describe being a founder?
Okay, I have to think about this one. I mean, I don't think this is going to be a controversial one, but probably resilience. And I mean that not just in the sense that like you're going to face setbacks. Am I allowed to give more than one word? I don't know. I'm not explaining
like everyone's
it.
going to. Feel free.
I mean it not just in the sense of like you're going to have setbacks. Things are going to be hard. Things are going to be challenging. But I think you have to be relentless and resilient in your vision of like where you think the world is going and why. And that is just as hard to like maintain when so many people are going to say that doesn't need to exist. That's never going to work. That's not going to be big. And so it's not so much the like resilience in terms of like the day-to-day practical things of it, but it's more the emotional resilience of like this, I believe this is going to work and I believe that this is going to be huge.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming and speaking on Community Capital. We're super excited to have you, and you can let our listeners and viewers know where to find you on Twitter or on Landing as well.
On X now.
And X, yes, okay.
I'm at Miri Buckland, and we're at landing.space on most places, TikTok, Instagram, and X. So yeah, you can find me on both those places.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yay.
That was fun.
Yeah.